He'd been serving coffee and small-town gossip for 9 years, running the only cafe in Cedar Falls, listening to local complaints, making sure everyone felt welcome in his quiet corner establishment. Just another elderly business owner trying to enjoy retirement. Until bodies started turning up with patterns that chilled him to the bone. And suddenly, the quiet cafe owner revealed why he understood the killer's mind better than anyone else. Franklin Thomas Garrett was 78 years old, with silver hair that had thinned to wisps and kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners from decades of listening to people's stories. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency behind the espresso machine, and his voice carried the patient cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime drawing information from reluctant sources while making them feel comfortable enough to share their deepest secrets. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue this powerful tale of hidden expertise and life-saving intuition, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories about quiet protectors deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Cedar Falls was the kind of small Montana town that appeared on postcards advertising rural American life. Population 2,847, surrounded by wheat fields and cattle ranches, where everyone knew their neighbors, and the biggest news usually involved high school football scores or county fair competitions. Main Street contained exactly what visitors expected: a hardware store that had been family-owned for 3 generations, a bank with hand-painted signs, and Frank's Corner Cafe, the social center where residents gathered to discuss weather, politics, and the gentle gossip that connected small communities. Frank had purchased the cafe 9 years ago, transforming it from a struggling diner into the warm gathering place that Cedar Falls had always needed. He served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, homemade pastries that drew customers from neighboring towns, and provided the kind of patient conversation that made people feel heard in a world that seemed increasingly hurried and impersonal. His regular customers had become like family. Martha Henderson arrived every morning at 7 a.m. for black coffee and a blueberry muffin before opening her antiques shop. Sheriff Tom Bradley stopped by twice daily for coffee that fueled his patrol rounds through the county. Pastor Williams held informal counseling sessions at corner tables where parishioners felt more comfortable discussing personal problems than they did in formal church settings. "Morning, Frank. The usual?" "Already brewing, Martha. How's your granddaughter settling in at college?" "Missing home cooking, but excited about her veterinary studies. You always remember the important details." These daily interactions represented more than business transactions. They were the social fabric that held Cedar Falls together, with Frank serving as the gentle hub where information flowed and community connections strengthened. What none of his customers knew was that Special Agent Franklin Garrett had spent 31 years perfecting the art of listening to people, understanding their motivations and recognizing patterns that revealed dangerous truths hiding beneath surface appearances. Frank lived alone in a modest house 6 blocks from the cafe, a comfortable 2-story structure that he'd purchased with savings accumulated during his federal career. The main living areas reflected the taste of someone who appreciated comfort over style, furnished with practical pieces that prioritized function, and filled with books that suggested intellectual curiosity rather than academic pretension. But the home office on the 2nd floor told a different story entirely. The walls displayed certificates and commendations that spanned 3 decades of federal law enforcement, FBI Academy graduation, advanced training in criminal psychology, specialization certificates in serial crime investigation, and awards for cases that had saved communities from predators whose names still appeared in criminology textbooks. Bookshelves held technical references that most people would find disturbing: forensic psychology texts, criminal behavior analysis manuals, case studies of solved and unsolved serial crimes, and his own research papers that had contributed to understanding how violent criminals selected victims, established patterns, and escalated their activities over time. His specialty had been pattern recognition and psychological profiling, understanding how violent criminals thought, what motivated their actions, and how their behavior patterns revealed weaknesses that could be exploited during investigations. Frank had contacted with the most informed serial crime specialists 2 days before to branch his community with the latest techniques in preventing violent crimes. His work had taken him into the darkest corners of human psychology, consulting on cases where understanding the killer's mind was the only path to preventing additional murders. His profiles had been instrumental in capturing some of America's most notorious serial killers, while his training programs had taught thousands of law enforcement professionals to think like criminals without losing their humanity in the process. Retirement in 2015 was voluntary rather than mandatory. Frank had accumulated enough years of federal service to retire with full benefits, while still young enough to pursue civilian interests that didn't involve studying violent death for 8 hours every day. The café purchase wasn't about financial necessity. His federal pension provided comfortable retirement income. It was about finding purpose in work that involved understanding people for positive rather than investigative reasons, using psychological insights to build community connections rather than solve crimes, and applying pattern recognition skills to daily interactions that strengthen social bonds instead of exposing criminal behavior. But 30 decades of training in criminal psychology doesn't disappear because someone changes careers, and Frank's expert eye continued noticing details that suggested when normal community dynamics were being disrupted by influences that residents couldn't identify or understand. Wednesday, September 18th started like every other morning. Frank arrived at the cafe at 5:30 a.m., started the espresso machine, began baking fresh pastries, and prepared for another day of serving coffee while listening to the gentle rhythm of small-town conversation. Sheriff Bradley arrived at 7:15 a.m., earlier than usual, carrying the kind of tension that Frank recognized from thousands of law enforcement interactions during his federal career. "Morning, Frank. Coffee's fresh, but you look like you need something stronger." Sheriff Bradley was 42 years old, competent and dedicated, but with limited experience investigating crimes more serious than domestic disputes and occasional cattle rustling. He'd been elected sheriff based on community trust rather than advanced training in criminal investigation. "Frank, we've got a situation. Jenny Morrison didn't come home last night. Her car was found abandoned on County Road 12, keys still in the ignition, purse on the front seat." Frank poured coffee while his trained mind automatically began analyzing details that most people would hear as simple missing person information. Any signs of struggle around the vehicle? That's the strange part. No evidence of conflict, but her purse was sitting on the passenger seat like she'd placed it there deliberately, almost like she'd gotten out of the car voluntarily. Frank had investigated similar scenarios dozens of times during his federal career. Abandoned vehicles with personal belongings left behind in organized arrangements often indicated predators who used psychological manipulation rather than physical force to control victims initially. "Tom, did Jenny have any reason to leave town voluntarily? Relationship problems? Financial difficulties? Family conflicts?" "Nothing that would explain disappearing without a word. She's been dating Mike Stevens for 2 years. Planning to get engaged next month. Works at the bank, well-liked. No enemies anyone can think of." Frank served coffee while his psychological profiling instincts activated patterns of analysis he hoped never to need again. "Any other unusual incidents recently? People reporting feeling like someone's been watching them, receiving strange phone calls, or noticing unfamiliar vehicles in the area?" Sheriff Bradley paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Now that you mention it, Pastor Williams said 3 different parishioners have complained about feeling like someone's been watching them, and Mrs. Chen at the grocery store mentioned seeing the same pickup truck parked near the school on multiple days, the driver just sitting there, observing. Special Agent Garrett recognized the constellation of behavioral indicators immediately. Someone was conducting surveillance of Cedar Falls residents, studying daily routines and behavior patterns in preparation for criminal activity that would require detailed knowledge of potential victims. Jenny Morrison's disappearance wasn't a random crime or voluntary departure. It was the opening move by a predator who had been planning this operation for weeks or months. Frank needed to share his concerns without revealing the expertise that would raise uncomfortable questions about his background. Tom, this might be more serious than a simple missing person case. The behavioral patterns you're describing suggest someone who's been studying the community before taking action.
What do you mean? Someone who knows enough about Jenny's routines to approach her without triggering suspicion, who understood when and where she'd be vulnerable, and who had the confidence to abandon her vehicle knowing it wouldn't provide useful evidence. Sheriff Bradley stared at Frank with growing realization that his observations exceeded those of a typical cafe owner. Frank, how do you know about criminal investigation techniques? Frank looked around his peaceful cafe, at the morning customers who were beginning to arrive for coffee and conversation, at the community he'd spent 9 years protecting through hospitality rather than law enforcement. Special Agent Garrett faced a choice that would define how he spent the remainder of his life. He could maintain his civilian identity, provide informal assistance through careful suggestions, and hope that local law enforcement would develop effective investigative strategies before additional victims were taken. Or he could use 31 years of expertise in criminal psychology to protect Cedar Falls the way he'd been trained to do when similar predators threatened communities that couldn't defend themselves against sophisticated psychological manipulation. Frank made his decision in approximately 15 seconds. Tom, my name is Franklin Garrett. I'm a retired FBI agent, behavioral analysis unit, 31 years investigating serial crimes and training law enforcement in criminal psychology. Jenny Morrison's disappearance shows characteristics of organized predatory behavior that requires immediate federal assistance. The transformation was instantaneous. The friendly cafe owner disappeared, replaced by someone whose presence carried the authority of 3 decades protecting communities from exactly these kinds of threats. Based on the surveillance patterns you've described and the organized nature of Jenny's disappearance, we're dealing with a serial predator who's been studying Cedar Falls for weeks. This isn't his first victim, and it won't be his last unless we implement investigative strategies designed for exactly this type of criminal behavior. Sheriff Bradley sat in stunned silence as Frank continued with clinical precision that revealed extensive experience in similar situations. We need immediate federal assistance, expanded search parameters based on psychological profiling, and community protection protocols that account for a predator who understands small-town social dynamics well enough to exploit them systematically. Within 2 hours, Frank was working alongside FBI agents who had driven from the regional field office, implementing investigative strategies that drew upon his decades of experience with serial crime while adapting techniques for the unique vulnerabilities of rural communities. The psychological profile Frank developed identified the predator as someone with extensive knowledge of Cedar Falls' social patterns, familiarity with rural law enforcement limitations, and confidence that suggested previous successful operations in similar communities. The profile guided search efforts that located Jenny Morrison within 18 hours, alive, traumatized, but rescued before the escalation that Frank's analysis had predicted would occur within days. The subsequent investigation revealed that the predator had indeed been responsible for similar crimes in 3 other rural communities across the Mountain West, using identical surveillance and psychological manipulation techniques to target isolated women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate federal response. Agent Garrett, how did you identify the behavioral patterns so quickly? Special Agent Rebecca Martinez asked during the case debrief. Frank looked around the FBI command post that had been established in his cafe's back room, at the FBI agents who treated him as a peer despite his civilian clothes and cafe owner identity. Agent Martinez, I've spent 31 years learning to recognize these patterns. Rural communities are particularly vulnerable to predators who understand that isolation provides both opportunity and delayed response. My job here has been understanding this community well enough to recognize when someone was disrupting normal social dynamics. The story remained largely within law enforcement circles, protecting both operational security and Frank's privacy while ensuring that rural law enforcement agencies received training in recognizing similar threats. Frank returned to his cafe operations, serving coffee with the same warm hospitality that had characterized his pre-emergency work. But something had changed in his relationship with the community and his understanding of how his skills could continue serving others. "Frank, thank you for what you did," Martha Henderson said during the following week's morning coffee ritual. Frank looked up from the espresso machine, his kind brown eyes holding the calm intensity that had never quite disappeared. "Martha, I've been protecting people my entire adult life. The location may have changed, but the mission stays the same." "Were you really with the FBI?" Frank smiled, adjusting his cafe apron that covered federal credentials he'd hoped never to need again. "I've been many things over the years. Right now, I'm your coffee guy, who happens to know how to keep bad people from hurting good communities." Frank Garrett continued operating his cafe until he was 85 years old, serving as informal security consultant for rural law enforcement agencies while maintaining the gathering place that kept Cedar Falls connected and protected. Because he learned that the most effective community protection often comes from people whose expertise exceeds their visible roles, whose dedication continues regardless of official titles, whose understanding of human psychology serves both coffee and justice with equal commitment to keeping people safe.